All for Love by John Dryden. Table of Contents. Introductory Note. Dedication. Preface. Prologue. Dramatis Personae. Act 1. Scene 1. Act 2. Scene 1. Act 3. Scene 1. Act 4. Scene 1. Act 5. Scene 1. Epilogue. The age of Elizabeth, memorable for so many reasons in the history of England, was especially brilliant in literature and, within literature, in the drama, with some falling off in spontaneity. The impulse to great dramatic production lasted till the Long Parliament closed the theatres in 1642, and when they were reopened at the Restoration in 1660, the stage only too faithfully reflected the debased moral tone of the court society of Charles II. John Dryden, 1631 to 1700, the great representative figure in the literature of the latter part of the 17th century, exemplifies in his work most of the main tendencies of the time. He came into notice with a poem on the death of Cromwell in 1658, and 2 years later was composing couplets expressing his loyalty to the returned king. He married Lady Elizabeth Howard, the daughter of a royalist house, and for practically all the rest of his life remained an adherent of the Tory party. In 1663 he began writing for the stage, and during the next 30 years he attempted nearly all the current forms of drama. His Annus Mirabilis, 1666, celebrating the English naval victories over the Dutch, brought him in 1670 the poet laureateship. He had meantime begun the writing of those admirable critical essays represented in the present series by his preface to the Fables and his dedication to the translation of Virgil. In these he shows himself not only a critic of sound and penetrating judgment, but the first master of modern English prose style. With Absalom and Achitophel, a satire on the Whig leader Shaftesbury, Dryden entered a new phase, and achieved what is regarded as the finest of all political satires. This was followed by The Medal, again directed against the Whigs, and this by Mac Flecknoe, a fierce attack on his enemy and rival Shadwell. The government rewarded his services by a lucrative appointment. After triumphing in the three fields of drama, criticism, and satire, Dryden appears next as a religious poet in his Religio Laici, an exposition of the doctrines of the Church of England from a layman's point of view. In the same year that the Catholic James II ascended the throne, Dryden joined the Roman Church, and 2 years later defended his new religion in The Hind and the Panther, an allegorical debate between two animals standing respectively for Catholicism and Anglicanism. The Revolution of 1688 put an end to Dryden's prosperity, and after a short return to dramatic composition, he turned to translation as a means of supporting himself. He had already done something in this line, and after a series of translations from Juvenal, Persius, and Ovid, he undertook, at the age of 63, the enormous task of turning the entire works of Virgil into English verse. How he succeeded in this, readers of the Aeneid, in a companion volume of these classics can judge for themselves. Dryden's production closes with the collection of narrative poems called Fables, published in 1700, in which year he died and was buried in The Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey. Dryden lived in an age of reaction against excessive religious idealism, and both his character and his works are marked by the somewhat unheroic traits of such a period. But he was, on the whole, an honest man, open-minded, genial, candid, and modest, the wielder of a style, both in verse and prose, unmatched for clearness, vigor, and sanity. 3 types of comedy appeared in England in the time of Dryden: the comedy of humours, the comedy of intrigue, and the comedy of manners, and in all he did work that classed him with the ablest of his contemporaries. He developed the somewhat bombastic type of drama, known as the heroic play, and brought it to its height in his conquest of Granada. Then, becoming dissatisfied with this form, he cultivated the French classic tragedy on the model of Racine. This he modified by combining with the regularity of the French treatment of dramatic action a richness of characterization in which he showed himself a disciple of Shakespeare, and of this mixed type his best example is All for Love. Here he had the daring to challenge comparison with his master, and the greatest testimony to his achievement is the fact that, as Professor Noyes has said, fresh from Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, we can still read with intense pleasure Dryden's version of the story. Dedication. To the Right Honourable Thomas, Earl of Danby, Viscount Latimer, and Baron Osborne of Kiverton, in Yorkshire, Lord High Treasurer of England, one of His Majesty's most Honourable Privy Council, and Knight of the Most Noble Order of the Garter. My Lord, the gratitude of poets is so troublesome a virtue to great men, that you are often in danger of your own benefits, for you are threatened with some epistle, and not suffered to do good in quiet, or to compound for their silence whom you have obliged. Yet I confess, I neither am or ought to be surprised at this indulgence, for your lordship has the same right to favour poetry, which the great and noble have ever had. Carmen amat, quisquis carmine digna gerit. There is somewhat of a tie in nature betwixt those who are born for worthy actions, and those who can transmit him to posterity, and though ours be much the inferior part, it comes at least within the verge of alliance, nor are we unprofitable members of the Commonwealth when we animate others to those virtues, which we copy and describe from you. It is indeed their interest, who endeavor the subversion of governments, to discourage poets and historians, for the best which can happen to them is to be forgotten. But such who, under kings, are the fathers of their country, and by a just and prudent ordering of affairs preserve it, have the same reason to cherish the chroniclers of their actions, as they have to lay up in safety the deeds and evidences of their estates, for such records are their undoubted titles to the love and reverence of after ages. Your lordship's administration has already taken up a considerable part of the English annals, and many of its most happy years are owing to it. His Majesty, the most knowing judge of men, and the best master, has acknowledged the ease and benefit he receives in the incomes of his treasury, which you found not only disordered, but exhausted. All things were in the confusion of a chaos, without form or method, if not reduced beyond it, even to annihilation, so that you had not only to separate the jarring elements, but, if that boldness of expression might be allowed me, to create them. Your enemies had so embroiled the management of your office, that they looked on your advancement as the instrument of your ruin. And as if the clogging of the revenue and the confusion of accounts which you found in your entrance were not sufficient, they added their own weight of malice to the public calamity, by forestalling the credit which should cure it. Your friends on the other side were only capable of pitying, but not of aiding you no further. Help or counsel was remaining to you, but what was founded on yourself, and that indeed was your security, for your diligence, your constancy, and your prudence wrought most surely within, when they were not disturbed by any outward motion. The highest virtue is best to be trusted with itself, for assistance only can be given by a genius superior to that which it assists, and it is the noblest kind of debt, when we are only obliged to God and nature. This, then, my Lord, is your just commendation, and that you have wrought out yourself a way to glory, by those very means that were designed for your destruction. You have not only restored but advanced the revenues of your master, without grievance to the subject, and, as if that were little, yet the debts of the exchequer, which lay heaviest both on the crown and on private persons, have by your conduct been established in a certainty of satisfaction. An action so much the more great and honorable, because the case was without the ordinary relief of laws, above the hopes of the afflicted, and beyond the narrowness of the treasury too redressed, had it been managed by a less able hand. It is certainly the happiest and most unenvied part of all your fortune, to do good to many, while you do injury to none, to receive at once the prayers of the subject, and the praises of the prince, and, by the care of your conduct, to give him means of exerting the chiefest, if any be the chiefest, of his royal virtues, his distributive justice to the deserving, and his bounty and compassion to the wanting. The disposition of princes towards their people cannot be better discovered than in the choice of their ministers, who, like the animal spirits betwixt the soul and body, participate somewhat of both natures, and make the communication which is betwixt them. A king, who is just and moderate in his nature, who rules according to the laws, whom God has made happy by forming the temper of his soul to the constitution of his government, and who makes us happy by assuming over us no other sovereignty than that wherein our welfare and liberty consists. A prince, I say, of so excellent a character, and so suitable to the wishes of all good men, could not better have conveyed himself into his people's apprehensions than in your lordship's person, who so lively expressed the same virtues, that you seem not so much a copy as an emanation of him. Moderation is doubtless an establishment of greatness, but there is a steadiness of temper which is likewise requisite in a minister of state, so equal a mixture of both virtues, that he may stand like an isthmus betwixt the two encroaching seas of arbitrary power and lawless anarchy. The undertaking would be difficult to any but an extraordinary genius, to stand at the line, and to divide the limits, to pay what is due to the great representative of the nation, and neither to enhance, nor to yield up, the undoubted prerogatives of the crown. These, my lord, are the proper virtues of a noble Englishman, as indeed they are properly English virtues, no people in the world being capable of using them. But we who have the happiness to be born under so equal, and so well poised a government, A government which has all the advantages of liberty beyond a commonwealth, and all the marks of kingly sovereignty, without the danger of a tyranny. Both my nature, as I am an Englishman, and my reason, as I am a man, have bred in me a loathing to that specious name of a republic, that mock appearance of a liberty, where all who have not part in the government are slaves, and slaves there of a viler note than such as are subject to an absolute dominion. For no Christian monarchy is so absolute, but it is circumscribed with laws, but when the executive power is in the lawmakers, there is no further check upon them. And the people must suffer without a remedy, because they are oppressed by their representatives. If I must serve, the number of my masters, who were born my equals, would but add to the ignominy of my bondage. The nature of our government, above all others, is exactly suited both to the situation of our country, and the temper of the natives, an island being more proper for commerce and for defense, than for extending its dominions on the continent, for what the valor of its inhabitants might gain, by reason of its remoteness, and the casualties of the seas, it could not so easily preserve, and, therefore, neither the arbitrary power of one in a monarchy, nor of many in a commonwealth, could make us greater than we are. It is true that vaster and more frequent taxes might be gathered, when the consent of the people was not asked or needed, but this were only by conquering abroad, to be poor at home, and the examples of our neighbors teach us that they are not always the happiest subjects, whose kings extend the dominions farthest. Since therefore we cannot win by an offensive war, at least a land war, the model of our government seems naturally contrived for the defensive part, and the consent of a people is easily obtained to contribute to that power which must protect it. Felicis nimium bona si sua norent Anglicanae. And yet there are not wanting malcontents among us, who, surfeiting themselves on too much happiness, would persuade the people that they might be happier by a change. It was indeed the policy of their old forefather, when himself was fallen from the station of glory, to seduce mankind into the same rebellion with him, by telling him he might yet be freer than he was, that is, more free than his nature would allow, or, if I may so say, than God could make him. We have already all the liberty which free-born subjects can enjoy, and all beyond it is but license. But if it be liberty of conscience which they pretend, the moderation of our church is such that its practice extends not to the severity of persecution, and its discipline is withal so easy that it allows more freedom to dissenters than any of the sects would allow to it. In the meantime, what right can be pretended by these men to attempt innovation in church or state? Who made them the trustees, or, to speak a little nearer their own language, the keepers of the liberty of England? If their call be extraordinary, let them convince us by working miracles, for ordinary vocation they can have none, to disturb the government under which they were born, and which protects them. He who has often changed his party, and always has made his interest the rule of it, gives little evidence of his sincerity for the public good. It is manifest he changes but for himself, and takes the people for tools to work his fortune. Yet the experience of all ages might let him know that they who trouble the waters first have seldom the benefit of the fishing, as they who began the late rebellion enjoyed not the fruit of their undertaking. but were crushed themselves by the usurpation of their own instrument. Neither is it enough for them to answer that they only intend a reformation of the government, but not the subversion of it. On such pretense all insurrections have been founded. It is striking at the root of power, which is obedience. Every remonstrance of private men has the seed of treason in it, and discourses which are couched in ambiguous terms are therefore the more dangerous, because they do all the mischief of open sedition, yet are safe from the punishment of the laws. These, my lord, are considerations which I should not pass so lightly over, had I room to manage them as they deserve, for no man can be so inconsiderable in a nation as not to have a share in the welfare of it, and if he be a true Englishman, he must at the same time be fired with indignation, and revenge himself as he can on the disturbers of his country. And 2. Whom could I more fitly apply myself than to your lordship, who have not only an inborn, but an hereditary loyalty, the memorable constancy and sufferings of your father, almost to the ruin of his estate, for the royal cause, were an earnest of that which such a parent and such an institution would produce in the person of a son. But so unhappy an occasion of manifesting your own zeal in suffering for his present majesty, the providence of God, and the prudence of your administration will, I hope, prevent that, as your father's fortune waited on the unhappiness of his sovereign, so your own may participate of the better fate which attends his son. The relation which you have by alliance to the noble family of your lady serves to confirm to you both this happy augury. For what can deserve a greater place in the English Chronicles than the loyalty and courage, the actions and death of the general of an army, fighting for his prince and country? The honor and gallantry of the Earl of Lindsey is so illustrious a subject that it is fit to adorn an heroic poem, for he was the protomartyr of the cause, and the type of his unfortunate royal master. Yet after all, my lord, if I may speak my thoughts, you are happy rather to us than to yourself. For the multiplicity, the cares, and the vexations of your employment have betrayed you from yourself, and given you up into the possession of the public. You are robbed of your privacy and friends, and scarce any hour of your life you can call your own. Those who envy your fortune, if they wanted not good nature, might more justly pity it, and when they see you watched by a crowd of suitors, whose importunity it is impossible to avoid, would conclude with reason that you have lost much more in true content than you have gained by dignity, and that a private gentleman is better attended by a single servant than your lordship with so clamorous a train. Pardon me, my lord, if I speak like a philosopher on this subject. The fortune which makes a man uneasy cannot make him happy, and a wise man must think himself uneasy when few of his actions are in his choice. This last consideration has brought me to another, and a very seasonable one, for your relief, which is that while I pity your want of leisure, I have impertinently detained you so long a time. I have put off my own business, which was my dedication, till it is so late that I am now ashamed to begin it, and therefore I will say nothing of the poem which I present to you, because I know not if you are like to have an hour, which with a good conscience you may throw away in perusing it, and for the author I have only to beg the continuance of your protection to him, who is, my lord, your lordship's most obliged, most humble, and most obedient servant, John Dryden. Preface. The death of Antony and Cleopatra is a subject which has been treated by the greatest wits of our nation after Shakespeare, and by also variously, that their example has given me the confidence to try myself in this vow of Ulysses amongst the crowd of suitors, and, withal, to take my own measures, in aiming at the mark. I doubt not but the same motive has prevailed with all of us in this attempt, I mean the excellency of the moral, for the chief persons represented were famous patterns of unlawful love, and their end accordingly was unfortunate. All reasonable men have long since concluded that the hero of the poem ought not to be a character of perfect virtue, for then he could not without injustice be made unhappy, nor yet altogether wicked, because he could not then be pitied. I have therefore steered the middle course, and have drawn the character of Antony as favorably as Plutarch, Appian, and Dion Cassius would give me leave, the like I have observed in Cleopatra. That which is wanting to work up the pity to a greater height was not afforded me by the story, for the crimes of love, which they both committed, were not occasioned by any necessity, or fatal ignorance, but were wholly voluntary, since our passions are all to be within our power. The fabric of the play is regular enough, as to the inferior parts of it, and the unities of time, place, and action, more exactly observed than perhaps the English theatre requires. Particularly, the action is so much one, that it is the only one of the kind without episode, or underplot, every scene in the tragedy conducing to the main design, and every act concluding with a turn of it. The greatest error in the contrivance seems to be in the person of Octavia. For, though I might use the privilege of a poet to introduce her into Alexandria, yet I had not enough considered that the compassion she moved to herself and children was destructive to that which I reserved for Antony and Cleopatra, whose mutual love being founded upon vice must lessen the favor of the audience to them, when virtue and innocence were oppressed by it. And, though I justified Antony in some measure by making Octavia's departure to proceed wholly from herself, yet the force of the first machine still remained, and the dividing of pity, like the cutting of a river into many channels, abated the strength of the natural stream. But this is an objection which none of my critics have urged against me, and therefore I might have let it pass, if I could have resolved to have been partial to myself. The faults my enemies have found are rather cavils concerning little and not essential decencies, which a master of the ceremonies may decide betwixt us. The French poets, I confess, are strict observers of these punctilios. They would not, for example, have suffered Cleopatra and Octavia to have met, or, if they had met, there must have only passed betwixt them some cold civilities, but no eagerness of repartee, for fear of offending against the greatness of their characters, and the modesty of their sex. This objection I foresaw, and at the same time contemned, for I judged it both natural and probable, that Octavia, proud of her new-gained conquest, would search out Cleopatra to triumph over her, and that Cleopatra, thus attacked, was not of a spirit to shun the encounter, and it is not unlikely that two exasperated rivals should use such satire as I have put into their mouths, for, after all, though the one were a Roman, and the other a queen, they were both women. It is true, some actions, though natural, are not fit to be represented, and broad obscenities in words ought in good manners to be avoided, expressions therefore are a modest clothing of our thoughts, as breeches and petticoats are of our bodies. If I have kept myself within the bounds of modesty, all beyond it is but nicety and affectation, which is no more but modesty depraved into a vice. They betray themselves who are too quick of apprehension in such cases, and leave all reasonable men to imagine worse of them than of the poet. Honest Montaigne goes yet further. Nous ni sommes que cérémonie, la cérémonie nous import a less on la substance des choses. Nous tenons aux branches et abandonnons le tronc et le corps. Nous avons appris aux dames de rougir oins seulement nomme ce. Quels any pregnant occupant affaire, nous innocens appellent droit nos membres ane. Pregnans par de les employer à toute sorte de debauche. La cérémonie nous défend d'exprimer par paroles les choses licites et naturelles, et nous les croyons, la raison nous defender en fair point dillicites et mauvaises, a person en len croit. My comfort is that, by this opinion my enemies are but sucking critics, who would fain be nibbling at their teeth. Come. Yet in this nicety of manners does the excellency of French poetry consist. Their heroes are the most civil people breathing, but the good breeding seldom extends to a word of sense, all their wit is in their ceremony. They want the genius which animates our stage, and therefore it is but necessary, when they cannot please, that they should take care not to offend. But as the civilest man in the company is commonly the dullest, so these authors, while they are afraid to make you laugh or cry, out of pure good manners make you sleep. They are so careful not to exasperate a critic, that they never leave him any work, so busy with the broom, and make so clean a riddance, that there is little left either for censure or for praise, for no part of a poem is worth our discommending, where the whole is insipid, as when we have once tasted of pulled wine, we stay not to examine it glass by glass. But while they affect to shine in trifles, they are often careless in essentials. Thus their Hippolytus is so scrupulous in point of decency, that he will rather expose himself to death than accuse his stepmother to his father, and my critics, I am sure, will commend him for it. But we of grosser apprehensions are apt to think that this excess of generosity is not practicable, but with fools and madmen. This was good manners with a vengeance, and the audience is like to be much concerned at the misfortunes of this admirable hero. But take Hippolytus out of his poetic fit, and I suppose he would think it a wiser path to set the saddle on the right horse, and choose rather to live with the reputation of a plain-spoken, honest man, than to die with the infamy of an incestuous villain. In the meantime we may take notice, that where the poet ought to have preserved the character as it was delivered to us by antiquity, when he should have given us the picture of a rough young man of the Amazonian strain, a jolly huntsman, and both by his profession and his early rising a mortal enemy to love, he has chosen to give him the turn of gallantry, sent him to travel from Athens to Paris, taught him to make love, and transformed the Hippolytus of Euripides into Monsieur Hippolyte. I should not have troubled myself thus far with French poets, but that I find our Chedru critics wholly form their judgments by them. But for my part, I desire to be tried by the laws of my own country, for it seems unjust to me that the French should prescribe here till they have conquered. Our little sonneteers, who follow them, have too narrow souls to judge of poetry. Poets themselves are the most proper, though, I conclude, not the only critics. But till some genius, as universal as Aristotle, shall arise, one who can penetrate into all arts and sciences without the practice of them, I shall think it reasonable that the judgment of an artificer in his own art should be preferable to the opinion of another man, at least where he is not bribed by interest or prejudiced by malice. And this, I suppose, is manifest by plain inductions, for, first, the crowd cannot be presumed to have more than a gross instinct of what pleases or displeases them. Every man will grant me this. But then, by a particular kindness to himself, he draws his own stake first, and will be distinguished from the multitude, of which other men may think him one. But, if I come closer to those who are allowed for witty men, either by the advantage of their quality, or by common fame, and affirm that neither are they qualified to decide sovereignly concerning poetry, I shall yet have a strong party of my opinion, for most of them severally will exclude the rest, either from the number of witty men, or at least of able judges. But here again they are all indulgent to themselves, and every one who believes himself a wit, that is, every man, will pretend at the same time to a right of judging. But to press it yet further, there are many witty men, but few poets, neither have all poets a taste of tragedy. And this is the rock on which they are daily splitting. Poetry, which is a picture of nature, must generally please, but it is not to be understood that all parts of it must please every man. Therefore is not tragedy to be judged by a witty man, whose taste is only confined to comedy. Nor is every man, who loves tragedy, a sufficient judge of it. He must understand the excellences of it too, or he will only prove a blind admirer, not a critic. From hence it comes that so many satires on poets and censures of their writings fly abroad. Men of pleasant conversation, at least esteemed so, and endued with a trifling kind of fancy, perhaps helped out with some smattering of Latin, are ambitious to distinguish themselves from the herd of gentlemen by their poetry. Raris enim firm sensis communis in illa fortuna. And is not this a wretched affectation, not to be contented with what fortune has done for them, and sit down quietly with their estate, but they must call their wits in question, and needlessly expose their nakedness to public view, not considering that they are not to expect the same approbation from sober men, which they have found from their flatterers after the third bottle. If a little glittering in discourse has passed them on us for witty men, where was the necessity of undeceiving the world? Would a man who has an ill title to an estate, but yet is in possession of it, would he bring it of his own accord, to be tried at Westminster? We who write, if we want the talent, yet have the excuse that we do it for a poor subsistence, but what can be urged in their defense, who, not having the vocation of poverty to scribble out of mere wantonness, take pains to make themselves ridiculous? Horace was certainly in the right where he said that no man is satisfied with his own condition, a poet is not pleased, because he is not rich, and the rich are discontented, because the poets will not admit him of their number. Thus the case is hard with writers. If they succeed not, they must starve, and if they do, some malicious satire is prepared to level them, for daring to please without their leave. But while they are so eager to destroy the fame of others, their ambition is manifest in their concernment. Some poem of their own is to be produced, and the slaves are to be laid flat, with their faces on the ground, that the monarch may appear in the greater majesty. Dionysius and Nero had the same longings, but with all their power they could never bring their business well about. 'Tis true, they proclaimed themselves poets by sound of trumpet, and poets they were, upon pain of death to any man who durst call them otherwise. The audience had a fine time owned. You may imagine, they sat in a bodily fear, and looked as demurely as they could, for it was a hanging matter to laugh unseasonably, and the tyrants were suspicious, as they had reason, that their subjects had them in the wind. So every man, in his own defense, set as good a face upon the business as he could. It was known beforehand that the monarchs were to be crowned laureates, but when the show was over, and an honest man was suffered to depart quietly, he took out his laughter which he had stifled, with a firm resolution never more to see an emperor's play, though he had been 10 years a-making it. In the meantime the true poets were they who made the best markets, for they had wit enough to yield the prize with a good grace, and not content with him who had 30 legions. They were sure to be rewarded, if they confessed themselves bad writers, and that was somewhat better than to be martyrs for their reputation. Lucan's example was enough to teach them manners, and after he was put to death, for overcoming Nero, the emperor carried it without dispute for the best poet in his dominions. No man was ambitious of that grinning honor, for if he heard the malicious trumpeter proclaiming his name before his betters, he knew there was but one way with him. Maecenas took another course, and we know he was more than a great man, for he was witty too, but finding himself far gone in poetry, which Seneca assures us was not his talent, he thought it his best way to be well with Virgil and with Horace, that at least he might be a poet at the second hand, and we see how happily it has succeeded with him, for his own bad poetry is forgotten, and their panegyrics of him still remain. But they who should be our patrons are for no such expensive ways to fame. They have much of the poetry of Maecenas, but little of his liberality. They are for prosecuting Horace and Virgil in the persons of their successors, for such is every man who has any part of their soul and fire, though in a less degree. Some of their little zanies yet go further, for they are persecutors even of Horace himself, as far as they are able, by their ignorant and vile imitations of him, by making an unjust use of his authority, and turning his artillery against his friends. But how would he disdain to be copied by such hands? I dare answer for him, he would be more uneasy in their company than he was with Crispinus, their forefather, in the holy way, and would no more have allowed him a place amongst the critics than he would Demetrius the mimic, and Tigelius the buffoon. Demetri tec Tigeli, discipulorum inter jubeo plorare cathedras. With what scorn would he look down on such miserable translators, who make doggerel of his Latin, mistake his meaning, misapply his censures, and often contradict their own. He is fixed as a landmark to set out the bounds of poetry. Saxum antiquum ingens, limes agro positus, litem ut discerneret avis. But other arms than theirs, and other sinews are required, to raise the weight of such an author, and when they would toss him against enemies. Genua labent, gelidis concrevit frigor sanguis. Tum lapis ipse viri, vacuum perenane volatis. Net spatium evacit totem nec pertilit ictum. For my part, I would wish no other revenge, either for myself, or the rest of the poets, from this rhyming judge of the 12-penny gallery, this legitimate son of Sternhold, than that he would subscribe his name to his censure, or, not to tax him beyond his learning, set his mark. For, should he own himself publicly, and come from behind the lion's skin, they whom he condemns would be thankful to him, they whom he praises would choose to be condemned. And the magistrates, whom he hath elected, would modestly withdraw from their employment, to avoid the scandal of his nomination. The sharpness of his satire, next to himself, falls most heavily on his friends, and they ought never to forgive him for commending them perpetually the wrong way, and sometimes by contraries. If he have a friend, whose hastiness in writing is his greatest fault, Horace would have taught him to have minced the matter, and to have called it readiness of thought, and a flowing fancy, for friendship will allow a man to christen an imperfection by the name of some neighbor virtue. Velam in amicitia sicararimus, aisti. Aurori nomen virtus posuisit honestum. But he would never allowed him to have called a slow man hasty, or a hasty writer slow. Drudge, as Juvenal explains it, cannabis pigris, scabiacu vestusta. Labibus a sicae lambentibus ora lucernae. Nomen erit pardis, tigris, leo, si quid aducest. Quod fremit in terris violentius. Yet Lucretius laughs at a foolish lover, even for excusing the imperfections of his mistress. Nigra less than Melitrus greater than est, Imiunda a fetida less than a cosmos greater than. Balba loqui non quid, less than Trelitz a greater than, muta pudens est, etc. But to drive it ad Ethiopium signum is not to be endured. I leave him to interpret this by the benefit of his French version on the other side, and without further considering him, than I have the rest of my illiterate senses, whom I have disdained to answer, because they are not qualified for judges. It remains that I acquire the reader, that I have endeavored in this play to follow the practice of the ancients, who, as Mr. Rymer has judiciously observed, are and ought to be our masters. Horace likewise gives it for a rule in his art of poetry. Vos exemplaria Graeca. Nocturna versit Manu, versit Diana. Yet though their models are regular, they are too little for English tragedy, which requires to be built in a larger compass. I could give an instance in the Oedipus Tyrannus, which was the masterpiece of Sophocles, but I reserve it for a more fit occasion, which I hope to have hereafter. In my style, I have professed to imitate the divine Shakespeare, which that I might perform more freely, I have disencumbered myself from rhyme. Not that I condemn my former way, but that this is more proper to my present purpose. I hope I need not to explain myself that I have not copied my author servilely. Words and phrases must of necessity receive a change in succeeding ages, but it is almost a miracle that much of his language remains so pure, and that he who began dramatic poetry amongst us, untaught by any, and as Ben Jonson tells us, without learning, should by the force of his own genius perform so much, that in a manner he hath left no praise for any who come after him. The occasion is fair, and the subject would be pleasant to handle, the difference of styles betwixt him and Fletcher, and wherein and how far they are both to be imitated. But since I must not be overconfident of my own performance after him, it will be prudence in me to be silent. Yet I hope I may affirm, and without vanity, that by imitating him I have excelled myself throughout the play, and particularly that I prefer the scene betwixt Antony and Ventidius in the first act to anything which I have written in this kind.